Namaste and greetings. I, Reet Lath, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evang Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI Web Policy Learning. Today marks the inaugural day of Diplomacy and Foreign Policy Cohort 3, theme towards Viksit Bharat, Developed India 2020-2047, an online international winter school program, a 2-month immersive online certificate training course. This training program is organized by IMPRI, Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies. So let's begin with a brief overview of the program. In an interconnected world where nations continually engage in complex interactions, the course on diplomacy and foreign policy emerges as a vital compass to navigate the ever-evolving landscape of international relations. At its core, this course is an exploration of how nations communicate, negotiate, and collaborate in the pursuit of their interests while avoiding conflict. It uncovers the art and science of diplomacy, revealing the intricate strategies and diplomatic tools that skilled diplomats employ. Simultaneously, it delves into the formulation and execution of foreign policy, deciphering the principles and practical steps that underpin a nation's engagement within global community. Therefore, a well-crafted foreign policy coupled with skilled diplomacy can lead to more peaceful and prosperous international relations. Whether you are an aspiring diplomat, policymaker, international relations scholar, or simply an enthusiast seeking deeper insights into the world of diplomacy, this course promises to be a transformative experience. Having successfully conducted 2 cohorts in the past, we bring a wealth of experience and refined content to ensure an engaging and impactful journey for all the participants. The chair of this program is Professor Swaran Singh ji, Professor and Chairperson, Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, New Delhi. This program also has an excellent panel of experts who will be sharing their expertise for the duration of this program. The distinguished expert panel includes Ambassador Shashank ji, Ambassador Latha Reddy ji, Dr. Lakshman Behra ji, Ambassador Partha Ray ji, Professor Shrikant Kondapalli ji, Professor Meenal Srivastava ji, Professor Prabhir De ji, Ms. Nandita Bharwa ji, Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya ji, Dr. Parma Sinha Palit ji, and lastly, Captain Alok Bansal ji. The panel of convener comprises of Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director, IMPRI, and Dr. Arjun Kumar ji, Director, IMPRI. Proceeding further, I welcome all the participants to this enlightening deliberation and thank you for being interested and putting your time, energy, and efforts into understanding emerging issues pertaining to diplomacy and foreign policy while helping us to bring together the practitioners and participants through this course for impactful policy research and action. We have also shared the course outline and reading resources in your email for your kind perusal. Before we start today's session, I would like to remind the housekeeping announcements once again. Please join the meeting on time. There will be a Q&A session after each presentation. Share your questions on the Q&A box. The questions must not be posted as anonymous attendee. Ensure that your questions are precise. And lastly, refrain from making general comments in the question to save time. Now, without any further ado, let's start our program. It is my honor and privilege to invite the chair for the program, Professor Swaran Singh ji, to start the program with his opening chair remarks and overview of diplomacy and foreign policy. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Reet. I hope I am loud and clear to all of you.
Yes.
My great compliments to both Dr. Simi Mehta and Dr. Arjun Kumar for this successful start of the 3rd cohort on diplomacy and foreign policy, this time focusing on Viksit Bharat, which is a very exciting theme. But before I make my inaugural address or remarks, I think it is very useful to have our participants quickly introduce themselves so that we know the range of participants that we have who come from different disciplinary backgrounds. So if my request is acceptable, then maybe participants could switch on their videos and briefly, in less than a minute, just introduce yourself in terms of your name, which city you come from, and what is your own disciplinary background. Are you serving? Are you a student? And if you're a student, what are you studying, etc. So may I request our participants to, I see a large number of them are joining us gradually, one by one. So if you could, if they are hearing me, and if you can switch on your videos, so that we have a sense of what is the kind of cohort 3 that we have. And that will be useful to then organize our talks, keeping your own interests and disciplinary backgrounds in mind. You already know that IMPRI has arranged a very celebrated group of speakers, very senior retired diplomats, including Ambassador Shashank. You obviously have heard about him. Also senior scholars from think tanks, professors from universities. I teach in Jawaharlal Nehru University. I can see that Keshav has switched on his video. Likewise, if I can request my other participants also to switch on your videos, and we can have 5 minutes or 7 minutes of brief introductions so that all of you will know each other, and we will also know the kind of participants we have with us for this cohort 3. And that will be very useful in making interactions that will follow from here so that they are of use to you rather than each one just coming and making their own presentation without knowing who are the people he or she is speaking to. Let me ask, maybe we could begin with Keshav. I can see you. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself briefly?
Good evening, sir. And apparently, it's an honor to be here, guided by you for the program. So I'm Kaustav Borua. Apparently, I had a brief career with Rail Vikas Nigam Limited. I worked for the government of India for 2.5 years, following which I wanted to pursue a career with the Indian bureaucracy, because of which I have been preparing for my UPSC journey. And in the process, I got connected to the political science and international relations as my optional subject. And in the process, international relations has always amazed me thoroughly. And recently, I could also found an organization. It's called the Attaché, and for which I was very much keen to learn from the best in the country, which of course includes you. And having come across this program from IMPRI, that's the reason I wanted to join and connect with all of you people and learn from the best. This is who I am, sir.
Thank you so much. I was seeing Shivangi also, I think, had joined us. I can see her again.
Yes,
Please
sir.
go ahead. Please go ahead and introduce
Yeah.
yourself.
Hi, sir. Good evening. Myself, Shivangi. And as for now, I have done my master's from international relations, and I'm looking forward for PhD in international relations only. So that's why I have joined this program introduced by IMPRI. So looking forward to it, sir.
Excellent. I see that both of you have different backgrounds, but shared interests in international relations.
Yes, sir.
I see Kaustav is doing PSIR for his civil services, and you want to do PhD in
Yes, sir.
international relations. I
Yes.
think the other participants may not be as yet ready to show us their videos on. So we will begin with today's discussion in general about discussing what is this whole discussion about foreign policy and what are we going to do over this next 2 months of discussions about diplomacy and foreign policy. Some of you may have had your own experience in advance. I hope you are able to see my slides now, and I will start with play. Is my slides now visible to all of you?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Excellent. So
Yes,
first
sir.
of all, thank you, Reet, for helping me. First of all, welcome to this online international winter school program of IMPRI. This is going to be 2 months of immersive online certificate training course. And we underline the word immersive because here it's going to be intensive discussions with scholars of great experience and reputation. And all of you must make sure you have a takeaway from this. You must make sure that you're using your time in engaging these number of scholars and that will be coming to speak to you. So make it as immersive as possible for your own advantage. You can ask as many questions. In fact, I always believe that when participants make comments or ask questions, and that is a more useful exercise because the speaker then knows what exactly is the area of interest that a participant has. Otherwise, each of the speakers will come and make a general presentation on. We largely are talking about diplomacy and foreign policy, and the focus this time, as was mentioned, will be on towards Viksit Bharat or developed India. Today, since it is an opening inaugural interaction, I will be generally speaking to you on the broader theme of diplomacy and foreign policy, more largely on diplomacy and how diplomacy is different from foreign policy. At Jawaharlal Nehru University, I am now the professor for diplomacy and disarmament. So I'm delighted to open the discussion today. And this will be followed with very, very excellent presentations from now on. First question that this cohort must ask themselves or answer for themselves is, what is the need to study foreign policy? I mean, there is so much to learn. Some of you may be interested in horticulture. Some of you may be interested in classical music. Some of you may be interested in economics or geography or even social sciences disciplines of a whole range. Why do we need to focus on foreign policy is the first question that all of you need to understand. First, quick, easy answer is that the world is getting very rapidly interconnected. Thanks to infusion of technology, all of us, you, me, everybody is becoming extremely, extremely connected. If you imagine your grandparents' connection, if they had about 200-300 people as friends, they were celebrities. I mean, they were really very, very important people to know 200 people. Now, each of you may be knowing thousands of people who are connected to you on social media, and you're sharing information, you're sharing ideas. And that increasing interconnectivity is also making our world increasingly interdependent. We begin to expect certain things from people we know or the platforms that you know online. And also, you are sure that your expectations are going to be fulfilled. For example, if there's an earthquake in any part of the world, you obviously will find either someone you know in that area or some news portal of that area. And you don't need governments to do that for you. You can do it yourself. So in that sense, the world is extremely connected is the first reality. And what happens to nation states? No nation state, now howsoever powerful that nation state can be, imagine United States. They can no longer solve their problems or harness their opportunities on their own. They on every issue need to work with other nations, more often with like-minded nations, as we say. So if you close your eyes, think of the 5 big challenges that India has. You will realize not one of those challenges India can deal with by itself. It will have to work with other countries. So what that means is that foreign policy is an expanding field. So much expanding that it includes all of you. In fact, let me say all of you are doing a little bit of foreign policy every day. For example, there is an intercity relationship. Cities are sister cities. Maybe Bombay and Shanghai, Chennai and Qingdao, or like that. Universities have MOUs and agreements with hundreds of universities around the world. So mayors have their own meetings. So fundamentally, all of you, sports ministries are doing foreign policy of global sports events. Education ministries are doing education connections with around the world. agriculture ministries are doing, every ministry, every city, every part of government, and every one of us is doing little bit of foreign policy, because hundreds of your friends around the world, maybe they know about India from you, whatever you told them. So foreign policy is a domain which is exponentially expanding. Now, what is the task of that foreign policy? I mean, then what is the foreign ministry doing if everybody, you and me, are doing foreign policy? We are still governed by nation states, and Ministry of External Affairs or Foreign Affairs, their job is no longer limited to only doing foreign policy. Their job now is to broadly define for all of us, for cities, governments, for ministries, for business people, for you and me, for universities, colleges. Foreign ministries have to define the broad bandwidth within which there are do's and don'ts. What should we do and what we should not do? Now, the purpose of that exercise is for each nation to mold or create external environment in such a fashion that that external environment is not anti-India pursuing its national goals. It should facilitate, it should make it easier for India to pursue its national goals. So India wants to share yoga as a health regime around the world. So Indian foreign policy has this as an important goal. And once you see the whole world doing yoga, whole world also becomes conscious of a country called India and what India is and how did yoga originate in India. Several examples can be given. So fundamentally, foreign policy is aiming to mold external environment in such a fashion that it helps India to achieve its national objectives. Now, in doing that, in molding that international environment, foreign policy uses many tools. These are the tools that foreign policy uses. It can use war. You see, now war is happening between Israel and Hamas, war is happening between Russia and Ukraine, many other wars. But less than wars, foreign policy also uses the tool of sanctions. You are hearing about how all Western nations have imposed economic sanctions on Russia. Now, if you travel to Russia, you cannot use your international credit cards anymore there. You have to use a local Russian credit card. Whereas everywhere around the world, you can use your credit cards and travel very easily. But nations also use spying. They have intelligence agencies. They use investments. They use trade. They use international law. If I have a problem with another country, I could go to International Court of Justice. I could go to Permanent Court of Arbitration in Hague. I could go to International Criminal Court. There are legal institutions. One can also use international organizations, World Trade Organization or World Tourism Organizations or World Health Organization and so on. Then there are also international norms evolved over a period of time. In last few decades, human rights have become very important norm. And if a country is seen doing ethnic cleansing, then there is something called right to protect doctrine. International community, UN Security Council can dispatch forces and sometimes even change the government, remove the leader. Democracy is another important norm. I come from disarmament studies, so nuclear taboo is another important norm. So foreign policy uses all these tools to create or mold external environment such that it is friendlier, it is helping each country, in our case India, to pursue its national objectives. Now, diplomacy is also a tool of foreign policy. I put it separately because diplomacy in that sense is all pervasive. It pervades in all other tools. Diplomacy operates in war, diplomacy operates in spying, in sanctions, in investments, in trade, everything. So diplomacy also is fundamentally a tool of foreign policy. But as we are saying, foreign policy is everybody's business. Just like diplomacy is also becoming all-pervasive, it's into everything, but yet diplomacy is not foreign policy. We will discuss that. Diplomacy still remains a tool that serves your foreign policy goals. And foreign policy has goals that are national objectives, which is where foreign policy can help. And foreign policy also uses all the leverages. If India is a great cultural hub, we will use culture as our leverage. If India is a technology hub, we will use technology as our leverage. If India is a great democracy, we will use that as a leverage. If India has a lot of economic power, India is now rapidly growing economy, we use those leverages. So we also have leverages that make us pursue foreign policy goals in that sense. And diplomacy by itself is also called a process, it's called institution, it's also professional service. Diplomacy since ancient times began in a very different fashion because at that time, transport and communications were very different. It was very difficult to go from one place to another place. It took sometimes weeks on horseback. It sometimes took months on the ship to go from one country to another. So usually, when we started this whole institution of ambassadors in residence, that means someone from a foreign country is going to live in my country permanently and deal with the relationship of two countries. Initially, they were called plenipotentiaries because transport and communication was very slow. Plenipotentiary ambassadors had a lot of powers. They could take a lot of decisions on behalf of the emperor or the king because it was not easy to transport and communicate. So he was authorized to make decisions. And then, of course, when we started nation states, we normally say Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, we gradually moved into what we call professional service. Now, diplomats initially used to be close confidants of the emperor or the king, who the king could trust. Now, it is a professional service. And if you are an excellent, brilliant young person who wants to be a diplomat, you have to pass through an examination, then you have to go through a training, and you start your career in Indian Foreign Service. You don't have to be son of a king or nephew of a king, as it was in ancient times. So we say that in ancient times, till early modern times, a good handwriting was very important for plenipotentiary ambassadors, so that when the message reaches the king after 6 weeks or 6 months, the king should be easily able to read your message. You should be very articulate in your speaking, so that the king in whose kingdom you are posted should be happy to listen to you. Now, diplomatic service is very complex. It has to do many, many things. Let me share with you what do our diplomatic missions do today compared to plenipotentiaries of ancient times till early modern times. Today, diplomatic service is a very specialist service. They are trained rigorously, and there are mid-career trainings also, because they are doing very interesting specialized jobs. For example, the most important thing for a country like India, which is rapidly growing economy, going to be third largest economy, that is why we are discussing Viksit Bharat, is how to expand and make India's exports competitive. Why should world buy Indian products? Because that is how Indian economy will grow and become third largest. Perhaps you did not think of it that as an IFS officer, you will be doing this. About 15 years ago, in a very famous speech, Indira Nooyi addressing Indian ambassadors had said that in 21st century, ambassadors will be no different than salesmen in PepsiCo. So, most important thing is how to help your economy to grow and become powerful economy is to expand exports. Second, equally important, is to attract foreign investments. If your country is growing very fast, then the world wants to come and invest in your country because that is where they will make profit. If they're investing in a country which is not growing rapidly, they will not make profits. So the world wants to invest in a country which is growing very fast. So I invest $1 and maybe I earn $2. So attracting foreign investments. Then of course, wooing technology transfers, because historically, obtaining advanced technology has not been easy. Countries that achieved or made or innovated advanced technologies, they normally did not share that technology with everybody because that technology gave them advantage, gave them power, gave them special status. Or sometimes they shared it only with friends, or shared with lot of terms and conditions, or shared with lot of cost. So therefore, technology is developing around the world. How to make sure best technologies from around the world are able to come to India or come to the country where you are based. And therefore, our foreign service has to focus on wooing technology transfers to India. Then, of course, also focusing on what makes India unique. Is it tourism? Is it yoga? Is it Ayurveda? What is it? And creating niche markets so that world remembers of India for some niche market. That when they think of Ayurveda, they think of India. When they think of yoga, they think of India, the whole world. And creating those niche markets, and then creating such global marketing networks. Sometimes you have to work with others. Maybe not only India does yoga, let us say some other countries also do yoga. Maybe they have different techniques. Maybe they have different historiography of yoga. So how to create those, or networks of technology. You are hearing these days debates on semiconductors. There is a whole, sometimes we say chip, there is a book recently I was reading called The Chip War. Semiconductors is the most advanced technology that nations want to create a consortium. Only few nations should have that. So United States, Taiwan are countries that want to invest and manufacture semiconductor chips in India. How to do that networking? And then, of course, focusing on cultural connections, diaspora linkages. You see, in last 10 years, in India's foreign policy, cultural connections and diaspora connections have become very, very important part of foreign policy and diplomacy. And now comes the task for which diplomatic missions were first created. That is now much lower in the priority. Diplomatic missions were created fundamentally to look after what we call consular needs of our nationals. Let us say about 9 million Indians are in various Middle East countries. Whatever be their consular needs, our missions have to take care of those. And you have seen India has earned name around the world now to rescue Indian citizens from situations which are difficult when some conflicts and wars happen. It began in 1991 war in the Gulf area in Middle East, when Indian ships went there and brought Indian nationals back home for free. And the most recent example is that of Ukraine. 23,000 people were brought out of that war zone by Indian government for free. That is how originally these ambassadorial missions or resident ambassadors were created to look after our nationals, the French nationals in Great Britain, or Prussian nationals in France, or something like that. Now something that makes you often interact with embassies in your city is much lower in the hierarchy, in the priority. These are consular services or visitors. Some Americans want to come to India, our embassy will issue them visa or provide them information or connect them to various agencies in India. Those are consular services for the host country, people who want to visit India. Now you see, that is the original task, but now it is much lower in the priority. It's not the top priority now. And likewise, soliciting technical and financial assistance for development. Climate change, climate finance is a big debate these days. Now, perhaps you get an idea what our diplomacy does. Maybe you did not think of it in this fashion before. Another thing which is rapidly transforming what diplomacy does is globalization. I started by saying that we are all getting connected very rapidly. We are becoming interdependent. Something like a toothpaste that you use every morning, maybe the ingredients come from one country, they are manufactured in another country and packed in a tube that is made in another country, and marketing and selling controls are happening in another country. So this networking of what we call production chains or manufacturing chains is what is collectively called globalization. We are all becoming connected. Production lines are becoming interconnected. For example, you often hear India is the pharmacy of the world because we make very cheap generic medicines. But ingredients that we need to make those cheap medicines, from 70% to 90% of these we import from China. So interconnection and interdependence. Therefore, globalization is driving diplomacy in a very different fashion. But let's first begin by saying, what is globalization? How do the experts tell us what globalization is? In a most simple fashion, globalization, in a general consensus definition, means abolition of all restrictions. See, nation states created very hard boundaries. You cannot enter a state without its permission. You need visa, you need permission. But globalization is telling us, abolish all these restrictions, destroy all the boundaries, extinguish all the walls, economic, political, social, cultural, that come in the way of human development. See, now the focus is on human. You talk about human development, human security, that we are all ultimately human beings who are divided into nation states. And nation states are artificial. So if nation states artificially divide us and that somehow negatively impacts human development, we should do away with those things. But of course, within globalization, there are different proponents, there are different debates. Something globalization is good, something globalization is negative. So whether globalization is helping us eliminate poverty, for example, Jagdish Bhagwati, a great Indian scholar, global scholar now, he thinks, yes, globalization is helping us to deal with issues of poverty alleviation. Joseph Stiglitz, American scholar, thinks reverse. He thinks globalization is actually increasing discrimination, increasing inequality around the world, etc., etc. But they all collectively believe that in this rapidly changing phase of globalization, it is opening a new chapter for diplomacy. What is diplomacy? Diplomacy fundamentally, in a simple fashion, means all the cross-border activities, not of you and me, but those who are called agents of a territorial state. Diplomats fundamentally are officials representing Government of India, for example, a territorial state. So all the agents, now agents could also be, for example, sometime you could also send people who are not diplomats, but they are assigned as agents by Government of India. For example, in Indian embassies around the world, it's not only diplomats who are there. There are military men there. Sometimes there are medicine people there. All kinds of development engineers could be posted there. So those who are sent as representatives or agents of territorial state, whatever they do is called diplomacy. Whatever they do in official capacity. Not that if they are cooking their food in the evening, that's not diplomacy. Whatever they do on behalf of state. Now, if that is what we are saying, that diplomacy is the cross-border activity of diplomatic agents of territorial state, globalization is undoing territorialization. We are talking of deterritorialization, because we are all interacting on cyberspace, on virtual space, on open oceans, in outer space. Territoriality is becoming limiting factor over a period of time. So here, globalization, the strategies that it is using is basically weakening our sense of boundaries. For example, we travel so much now, but you never see the territorial boundaries of the state. What you see is airport. You go from one airport to another airport and you see customs agent sitting there. He stamps your passport and you enter that country. That means deterritorialization. You don't have to literally cross a land border or any river border or something, maritime boundaries, etc. So globalization, which is increasing transport and communication, is basically, in some sense, also undermining the old original task of diplomacy, because globalization is today powered by information technology, by trade, by flow of finance capital, flow of people, flow of cultures, food, and everything. So here we say that increasingly globalization is making non-state actors much more important. All the multinational corporations, all the international non-governmental organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, World Social Forum, and so on. Even terrorists, they are becoming increasingly important determinants, important players, important forces in how foreign policy is conducted. And therefore, it is also true at the same time that as we shift from 20th to 21st century, even the state diplomacy has shifted away from political to more and more economic and cultural domains and cultural issues. So there is even shift in state diplomacy over a period of time. And what we are seeing here is, in that sense, with this globalization, even when we agree that yes, deterritorialization is happening, but interaction is increasing. So even if interaction is not on the land border, but through the air or through virtual space, state still has responsibility, and state is sometimes contesting, sometimes fighting. It is creating new rules, for example, to deal with social media, to deal with information technology. It has to create new legislations. And likewise, diplomacy has also to find new ways of how to pursue national goals of foreign policy in this changing phase of globalization, which is transforming. So then in 21st century, what are the priorities with the globalization? With globalization now, diplomacy is focusing on very interesting issues. Fighting harmful double taxation. So many countries work on what they call double taxation agreements. Agreement that if a product is taxed in India and it is going to, let us say, Dubai, it should not be taxed also in Dubai again, or vice versa. Product in Dubai coming to India, if it is taxed in Dubai, should not be taxed in India again. So no double taxation. Improving labor standards, antitrust regulations, transparency of hedge funds. You're hearing about so many revelations about various kind of documents that are coming out. Agricultural subsidies, how do they impact exports? So very interesting new areas are opening up for diplomacy to engage with and influence external environment in these domains in such a fashion that Indian farmer, Indian artisan, Indian craftsman is able to still survive and thrive and export things around the world. Of course, at the same time, the old activity has also continued and expanded. The old activity was to provide consular services to your nationals or visitors from abroad. That number has also constantly been increasing. More and more, millions of people from India are traveling out of the country every year, and millions of people are coming into India every year. So here, to deal with this increasing onslaught. So much more work. What is diplomacy doing? What is that strategy that they are evolving around the world as to how to deal with so many new issues and expanding number of things to do what existed from ancient times? European Union, for example, decided to merge their sovereignty. So 27 countries have come together and they issue now just one visa. It's called Schengen visa. Some of you know it. So they collectively don't issue separate visas for Estonia, for Lithuania, for Sweden, for Britain is not in EU now. But they issue one visa. That means they can collectively join their forces and pool their resources together to deal with who are called outsiders of European Union. And they issue one visa to all of these people to come in. And within Schengen Treaty nations, they can move freely, no problem. But when they have so much force, they can now focus on being more stringent, being more careful in monitoring the compliance to all the rules, monitoring of any infringements, any threats that may come from outside Europe. So that is a new diplomatic method to deal with people who are coming in and going out, how to deal with them. Of course, the whole diplomatic discussions on areas of nuclear weapons, on terrorism, have also shifted the focus of states because they think waging wars is not possible. So they have shifted from the old-fashioned focus on waging wars to now securing peace. Securing peace is more important, and they want to secure peace at all costs. And therefore, it seems the original power of the state, which was its capacity to fight wars, it seems that power apparently is shifting to how peaceful a state is and how much peacemaking it is doing around the world. So you're reading now, for example, a scholar called Joseph Nye, who talks about soft power. Hard power is not as important now. Soft power is more important. Smart power is more important. And that is the use diplomacy makes in ensuring, for example, India is taking initiatives in accelerating the peace process in Ukraine crisis now. That has made security issues a shift from ministries of defense to ministries of external affairs, because more focus is on peace rather than war. And therefore, it is the diplomatic service which is now focusing on how to ensure peace, and ministries of external affairs or foreign affairs are doing much more work. For example, many of the countries, when they have these counter-terror networks of various nations working together, sharing information, that is the nodal agency normally is not Ministry of Defense. Nodal agencies are Ministry of External Affairs or Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Counter-terrorism groups, for example, working groups are also hosted and located in Ministry of External Affairs. Diplomats often lead discussions on those and cooperation on those, sometimes supported by soldiers also. So what is this nature of global diplomacy that we are discussing now? Diplomacy remains, of course, as a tool of statecraft, a tool of foreign policy. Originally, of course, that was true, but now we also have something called international governmental organizations and international non-governmental organizations. International governmental organizations, United Nations is the easy example, but several other, about 1,200 such international governmental organizations. Similarly, international non-governmental organizations. Now, over a period of time, because of the time and space shrink, as we say, we are all getting connected. That has made these international governmental organizations very powerful. Very quick example would be World Bank and IMF. When they want to give any aid and assistance to any country, it can put conditions that I will give you assistance if you do these following 5 things. And international governmental organizations are now becoming just as powerful as nation states. but they are much bigger than nation states now. Imagine UN Security Council, deciding to launch a peace enforcement mission against Libya, where it can remove Gaddafi. So nation states are becoming less powerful, and international government organizations are appearing to be much more powerful. Now, diplomats, of course, manage foreign policy goals, but diplomacy today, therefore, is not just a means, because now we also have diplomacy of not just nation states, but also of international government organizations. That makes diplomacy very powerful. It is developing its own grammar, its own norms, its own nature, its own professional. And therefore, now sometimes it seems there is a greater overlap between foreign policy and diplomacy, because we now have something called as international civil servants also. Now, when we talk of what fundamentally diplomacy has to do, and does international governmental organizations do the same, first thing diplomats have to look at is who to talk to, which often also means whether state A has given official diplomatic recognition to another state. When a new state is formed, it needs other sovereign states to recognize it, that it is also a sovereign state. Maybe sometime you read about Taiwan. Taiwan, which calls itself Republic of China, was seen as the real China for a long period of time, till about 1970s. People's, which is Communist China, People's Republic of China came in 1949, but much of the world did not recognize it as a nation state. They continued to think Taiwan is the real China. Now Taiwan is having less and less number of nation states recognizing it as real China. So that is very significant. Diplomatic relations happen only after diplomatic recognition. A state decides whether we will have diplomatic relations or we will not have diplomatic relations. So who to talk to is very significant. What language to talk with? Now you see Indian Prime Minister speaks in Hindi around the world. There is also a great demand that Hindi should be recognized as one of the languages of United Nations. So languages that are recognized as languages of United Nations have their advantage, because how we speak and write gives us power to influence the narrative, the agenda, the outcomes. So linguistic proficiency is very significant. Diplomats very often know more than one language. They know more than one international languages. Then what language? What is it? Official language? Is it working language? There are all kinds of categories that diplomats have to deal with. If some of you want to be foreign service official, you will know that diplomats have all kinds of writing tools. Aid memoirs, about the PPR, memoranda, non-paper, MOUs. Then there are non-verbal communications where signaling is very important, or sometimes messages through third party or through friends are significant. And in that sense, it looks like confusion that often happens is that diplomats sometimes begin to think that they are agents or representatives of the government, which they are not. They are representatives of the state. They are not representatives of the party in power. They are representatives of the territorial state. That is why I said territorial state. And that confusion sometimes also creates limitations. So how is this shift visible in shift from form to content? What is the form and what is the content? Diplomacy fundamentally involves negotiations in everything, whether you're negotiating with bilateral relationships or multilateral relationships in regional organizations, international organizations. It fundamentally means negotiations lie at the core of the conduct of diplomacy from ancient times. Now, in more modern times, in 21st century, we don't like to call it negotiations. We call it balancing. Balancing between multiple varying interests. If you're talking to 25 nations, then they all have different national objectives, they have different national interests. Now we call it balancing between various national interests to calibrate them in such a fashion that India's interests are also counted as important. But if you look at 200 years or 2000 years, then we usually say negotiations is at the core of diplomacy. Now, in the negotiations, it is not the negotiations the way you do with the shopkeeper when you buy some clothes. Here, negotiations fundamentally is a very special form of communications. Power lies in communication. How do you communicate? And communication skills have to be really important to achieve that balancing, particularly when there are contradictory interests. For example, Indo-US nuclear negotiations. United States doesn't want any next country to become a nuclear weapon state. India wants to be the next nuclear weapon state. So there's a contradiction in what they want to do, but they are able to balance. So we are able to find how can we work together, achieve certain amount of cooperation. What is the template which provides that balancing paradigm for us? So India today is called a country with advanced nuclear technologies. US calls us in that fashion and has asked us to separate military establishments which are doing nuclear weapon research and civil nuclear establishments and allow them access to see our civilian nuclear establishments. Historically, from millions of years, diplomacy always relied on confidentiality and chemistry. People who are negotiating or talking to each other, they must respect and trust each other's confidentiality. And they must have certain chemistry. They must like each other. They must not hate each other. And that has stayed very central to diplomacy all these years. Of course, now we live in a very different world. I told you, every one of you is doing diplomacy. So media is also doing diplomacy. Media's diplomacy is much faster, much open. Media is able to debate on diplomatic issues. Media is able to give judgments on how they think things should happen, whether India and Pakistan should begin to talk to each other or not. You see these television debates. People write in newspapers, people write on social media, and that is much faster. State takes long time to debate, consider as to what it has to say. But an expert like me and you could be going on television and saying something much faster and in a much open space, anytime, anywhere. And that has given much greater push to what used to be called public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is how do you engage the public in making them understand what foreign ministries are doing. So the diplomats are not only negotiating with foreign countries, they are also negotiating with their own people. They're trying to talk to all various ministries. For example, if Ministry of External Affairs wants to sign a, let us say, nuclear agreement, now they have to take Ministry of Science and Technology along. They have to take the Atomic Energy Commission along. Not just that, they have to explain to Indian people why are they negotiating with the United States. That is where public diplomacy becomes also responsibility of diplomatic service. And fundamentally, public diplomacy tries to contextualize, tries to explain why the policy that India pursued in 1970s needs to now change in 2024. We need to explain that to our people, because if we don't explain to people, they get angry. In next election, the government will fall and it will create more chaos. So it is the task of diplomats to explain national objectives of foreign policy to not just around the world to other people and other societies, but also to their own people. But most important, compared to television, compared to social media, where anybody can write anything. Public diplomacy is done by state and it uses only lawful means. And it is dependable. Researchers like me can use archives and rely on the information that I get in archives that come from these various documents that a result of public diplomacy. But I cannot quote a social media and feel that it is a reliable source for research on foreign policy. So here, let's look at what is happening to public diplomacy. First of all, public diplomacy was always there, even at ancient times when we spoke of plenipotentiary ambassadors. They had to make friends in the country where they are posted. They had to explain to people as to what they want to do in cooperation with the country where they are posted. So that has always been there. Even before formally a phrase was created, public diplomacy, and it became a domain, a subdomain of diplomacy as to what is public diplomacy. So problem is, in today's world, public diplomacy means engaging with representatives of political parties. So an American ambassador is posted in India. He is constantly in touch with various political leaders, with trade unions, with business leaders, with labor unions, with civil society, with civil servants, with universities, media, everybody. Fundamentally trying to explain to them as to why United States is doing what United States is doing. Otherwise, we will misunderstand United States. So they have to create these domestic constituencies in the country where they're posted so that this country understands why is United States doing what it is doing and whether it is good for India to work together with United States. So that everybody will be in agreement when the government makes a decision to begin cooperation with United States. The aim here is to then develop networks of people who will not just understand but cooperate in that embassy's work in the country when they want to invite great leaders, great scientists, and engage in cooperation with India, for example. So when it comes to such kind of modern public diplomacy, they also use a lot of engagement with media. They distribute films, they distribute magazines, they organize all kinds of conferences, meetings, talks, fundamentally to generate that influence, create certain amount of American influence in Indian thinking so that we understand what they're doing a little better rather than just getting angry with them. But other than media diplomacy, now more recently, there is also something called cyber diplomacy. Cyber diplomacy is done by netizens, influencers on social media. What they speak is read by sometimes millions of people. Sometimes some people have hundreds and thousands of followers. And public diplomacy, before it makes a decision to speak its mind, before the spokesperson of, let us say, Ministry of External Affairs addresses a press conference and explains that issue, netizens and influencers have already spread around the world what they think is happening, what they think should happen, what is good out of it, what is bad out of it. That has created even more challenge for public diplomacy, but it has also created opportunities. So we also now have cyber diplomacy as part of public diplomacy. So state also, as part of public diplomacy, does its own cyber diplomacy. It also engages the world and its own citizens using the same platform, social media. Indian Prime Minister, for example, has world's largest followers on Twitter. So he or his office also uses to engage social media. And here, in that sense, make sure the netizens are not saying something which is harming India's national interest, and public diplomacy, therefore, now also includes cyber diplomacy. When we talk of shift with pressure of cyber diplomacy and media diplomacy, public diplomacy, co-opting some of these things into it, it has shifted now from focus on influencing people to educating people, which is a greater objective. So now the diplomatic service, when it is engaged in public diplomacy, it is not trying to say, I'm trying to influence your opinion. I'm trying to educate you is the new focus. So that by educating, of course, the real intention is that listeners, whether they're in a host country or in a home country or around the world, will perhaps develop a better understanding of what a country is trying to do. But then public diplomacy has some challenges, simple challenges. cyber diplomacy, because it is so rapid, if some of you have Twitter, it moves so fast. You put on a message and within seconds, hundreds of other messages have come and your message has really gone far, far beneath. It's lost in the crowd. So because of that speed and scale, sometimes public diplomacy, to deal with this influence of cyber diplomacy, begins to focus on issues which are not really critical. Sometimes you feel that netizens are pushing public diplomacy into engaging with issues which are perhaps not the most important issues for that state. But because of the pressure from cyber diplomacy, it can also create problems of quantity versus quality. When you're focusing on too much speed, maybe there are errors in your information. So public diplomacy has to be careful that when it is becoming very, very fast, it doesn't end up not just deviating from real issues, but also focusing on quantity over quality. For example, do I want to tweet 2,000 messages every day, which 1,800 have some mistakes, or I want to only put 50 messages in a year, making sure they are accurate? That pressure also is there. And of course, it needs far greater and quick coordination with all the other stakeholders. If there's Ministry of External Affairs controlling, diplomatic services, looking at that, how national goals are to be pursued, and they are engaging public diplomacy on cyber diplomacy and cyberspace, they have to constantly take feedback from several other departments or ministries. For example, if they're writing something about terrorism issue happened in Kashmir, they have to check with other state government, with Home Affairs, Ministry of Home Affairs, maybe with other agencies like National Investigating Agency and so on. So that speed and scale is putting enormous challenge on diplomatic service in that sense, which is engaged in that sense. So fundamentally, what we are saying is that the whole canvas of diplomacy, the domain of diplomacy, has expanded exponentially, enormously. But what is most interesting, at the same time, it has seen greater stress on specialization. Sometimes we say, let us focus narrowly on specialization. So I am not kind of, becoming a journalist. I'm not trying to be know-it-all kind of thing. I'm trying to know only specialization. I'm specialist on this area. But diplomacy is now seeing both things happening simultaneously. It is expanding the canvas into whole new areas, becoming part of diplomatic engagements. Numbers of those activities increasing, people who are traveling are increasing, but also negotiations. Today, diplomats have to negotiate, for example, United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas, United Nations Convention on Outer Space, or Indo-US nuclear deal. They need to know all these specialization areas, and sometimes they co-opt people from other domains as well. Another fundamental change in diplomacy, I did mention of international governmental organizations. Because of the time and space shrink, I see that I will take maybe about 10 other minutes. It's already 5 o'clock. I should have been maybe faster than this. Multilateral diplomacy, particularly summit diplomacy, is becoming very popular. You often see, let's say, give an example of India-China leaders. If Chinese leader visits India, you will say, oh, he is visiting here after 5 years. But Indian and Chinese leaders may have met 25 times in international forums, in other international multilateral organizations. So multilateral interactions, not only of national leaders, but also diplomats, is happening much more regularly than in bilateral old-fashioned way. Now, that has been facilitated by modern technologies of transport and communication, and which has made multilateral diplomacy high in demand. And that has created multilateral organizations. I told you about 1,200 international governmental organizations. And because they are very super powerful kind of multilateral international organizations, they have their own civil servants. They are international civil servants. And just like national diplomats are always focusing on how to pursue national interests, international civil servants today focus on how to achieve interests of their international governmental organization. So international civil servants of, let's say, World Health Organization, they are not worried about India's national interest or China's national interest or United Nations or United States national interest. They are only worried about how to take forward WHO's interests forward. So they are not territorial states, they are international organizations. And they are emerging very, very powerful in that sense. And they're doing something completely different. And that is where I think many national civil servants today aspire to become international civil servants because of remunerations being better, exposure to the whole world being better. All kinds of advantages come by becoming not just national civil servants, but international civil servants. Particularly if your country is least developed or developing country, maybe United States diplomats may not be interested to become international civil servants, but they also very often control many of the international governmental organizations. For example, World Bank president is always an American citizen. These had begun, multilateral organization had started way back in 1874, Universal Postal Union. These multilateral organizations began simply nation states controlling them, nation states debating issues, nation states taking decisions, and multilateral organizations simply facilitating those conversations. Today, these international organizations have become very powerful. They have their own agenda, they have their own secretariat, they have their own constitution or convention, they have their own civil service. And it's very different kind of multilateral diplomacy that we notice happening now around the world. So what we are seeing here is that not many countries have presence in as many countries. For example, European Union, which is not a nation state, it's a multilateral European Union organization. It has embassies in 118 countries. Not many countries can afford to have embassies in so many countries. India, of course, has in much more. Then it also has many of its offices in other international governmental organizations. United Nations Development Program has presence in 177 countries. So imagine how powerful these multilateral organizations have come to be. And that has made multilateral diplomacy synonymous with what we call parliamentary diplomacy. What happens in parliament? Different parties try to push their own agenda. They want to make sure the laws are made in implementing the manifesto of my party. So parliamentary debates and some of these multilateral diplomacy debates are becoming very, very similar. And reverse of it, multilateral diplomacy happens at the top end, at the global level. Then at the bottom is subnational diplomacy. For example, in India's case, West Bengal has its own diplomacy because when it comes to relations with Bangladesh, West Bengal is very important. When it comes to relations with Pakistan, Punjab is very important. When it comes to relations with Sri Lanka, Tamil Nadu is very important. When it comes to relations with Nepal, Bihar is very important. So national leaders in New Delhi have to look after the interests of these provincial units also. So what we are saying, particularly in federations, in federal republics that India is, federal units, sometimes cities. Shanghai, for example, has GDP much larger than maybe 50, 60 countries from the bottom of the pyramid. It's very powerful municipality of a city. Similarly, federal units, like I gave example of Tamil Nadu or West Bengal or Punjab, they are also very significant in how foreign policy is run. So this is sometimes also called paradiplomacy or constituent diplomacy, which is where there's a direct role in foreign policy of federal units. And they carry enormous influence in how the foreign policy is going to be conducted. Is the Chief Minister of West Bengal willing to go with the Prime Minister to Bangladesh or not willing to go? It can influence success and failure of both diplomacy and foreign policy. And therefore, it's interesting to see how various party leaders, how various lobbyists, and we now have something called brand ambassadors. Not just nations have brand ambassadors. For example, tourism in India can have Amitabh Bachchan as a brand ambassador. But international governmental organizations, Human Rights Watch, for example, can have its own brand ambassador. And sometimes these brand ambassadors are celebrities, Hollywood stars or Bollywood stars. And they are much more visible than your state ambassadors. So they are also, in that sense, part of that constituent diplomacy, which is what we're discussing. Let me try to quickly close some of these. I want to make sure we engage you in discussion and listen to you. Then, of course, cultural diplomacy has become very, very powerful lately. Fundamentally, cultural diplomacy aims to make sure that the world outside and the world inside develops a more mature understanding of my country, who we are. For example, if there is a much more stereotype or romantic imagination of India, people will talk about ancient wisdom, ancient traditions, cultural diversity, or if there's a great utilitarian focus, then they'll start talking about retrogressive practices in social practices of India, pollution in Delhi, or poverty, and so on. How to develop a complex and more mature understanding of what are the strengths and limitations of my country is where cultural diplomacy becomes significant. Cultural diplomacy also helps in soft balancing, in creating bridging, particularly in difficult relations. Two countries having difficult relations, two countries starting a new relation can start with cultural relations to begin with, and then come to more difficult issues and go all the way to defense cooperation and so on. So that is also something which is becoming much more interesting part of diplomacy today. Let me close quickly by talking of future trends. Historically, you remember I said we started diplomacy in terms of plenipotentiaries. And we have come all the way now to 21st century, 2024, where Britain was the first country to start with what they called laptop ambassadors. Because today we live in a world of constant connectivity. Right now, you are connected with the world in real time. So when we had these longitudes, latitudes, altitudes, they're no longer relevant because now you can in real time right now talk to any part of the world. Time zones were created so that I can send instructions to faraway place that please do this at your 9 a.m. I will be sleeping at that time. But now I can speak to them at their 9 a.m. directly by connecting on phone or on social media or whatever else. So in that new world, it looks like creating large mansions, buildings, cars, all kinds of equipment, housing for ambassadors. It's an old thing. I mean, if somebody was to now start asking you to stop using laptops and start writing on paper, it could be strange for you. So perhaps now what we used to call resident ambassadors could be seen as perhaps much vulnerable, cumbersome, expensive, not very useful. And they are becoming more majestic rather than functional or effective. That is one view. And therefore, UK was the first country to start talking about laptop ambassadors or laptop diplomats. You'd only need a mobile phone and a laptop, and you could be going around the world, connecting with people where you're required, not just fully staying there forever. When you're needed, you will go there. This is how corporate sector works, for example. If in a corporate sector, somebody is needed to work in Bangalore, they'll send him to Bangalore for 2 days and then he comes back. Reverse is also an argument, which means that because of globalization, there's a whole proliferation of new ideas, new issues, new actors, new engagements. As I mentioned to you, it's an exponential explosion of activities that diplomacy has to now deal with. And in that sense, it looks like that our expanding interdependence is throwing so much of added work for diplomats to pursue foreign policy goals. And for everything, you remember I started by saying for everything you need joint solutions. No nation can work by itself. It must work with others. And that means that institution of diplomacy has transformed. We today talk of cyber diplomacy, media diplomacy, summit diplomacy, international governmental organizations, and so on. where political executives are traveling on regular basis. Your national prime ministers are traveling all the time, interacting with other leaders all the time, taking decisions like never before. So the reverse view is that the responsibility of foreign policy and diplomacy has not just expanded enormously, but become extremely complex and needs that professional service to become far more specialists rather than journalists in coming times. Let me stop here. I took a little longer time than I should have. And let me stop here and hope that you will be able to discuss things. I hope you are hearing me when I was speaking.
Thank you so much, sir, for setting such a positive tone for this course. Your discourse has not only deepened our understanding, but has also ignited a renewed sense of passion and curiosity within each one of us. So, thank you so much, sir. The floor is now open for questions from the audience. You can raise your hands or type in the Q&A box. Vikas ji, I think you have a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, because you can either speak or maybe you can also open your video so that I can see you as we talk to each other. I think that's a possibility.
Good evening.
This media
Good evening,
allows us to
Professor.
see each other. Good evening.
Yes, sir.
So Zoom allows us to see each other and talk to each other rather than talking to just a blank screen. Thank you. Yes, I can see some of you are switching on your videos. Nice to see you.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. Thank you for the enriching and informative lesson. I could not
Yes.
introduce myself earlier. I'm Vikas Sharma. I am a graduate in computer engineering, and currently I'm also pursuing civil services. I'm also an aspiring diplomat. And sir, my question is with respect to public diplomacy, as you talked about. Sir, in the current events, in the international events, Western media plays a very strong role in pushing forward the narrative that is conducive to the US and Europe. And it does this at a scale that is very much not possible for India or the global South to counter. So, in such a scenario, how does India use public diplomacy to educate public's opinion and opinion about our interest and that of the global South collectively? What tools do India use in such a scenario?
Thank you, Vikas. I think that's a very interesting question coming from aspiring civil servant. And as I mentioned to you, whether you are in IFS or in any other IAS or IPS, you will be doing bit of foreign policy of your own, whatever be the service. Of course, you'll have different role in that sense. So it's important, even in IPS or allied services, you will be doing a lot of foreign policy, including public diplomacy, that the question you just asked. Second thing, as an aspiring civil servant, you also should know each nation has a unique set of leverages. And it brings to bear those leverages to achieve its national interest. And whether you are achieving that national interest as a scientist or as a diplomat, doesn't matter. You fundamentally have to rely on the leverages that a country has. And once you understand that, you immediately get to know that, yes, United States has much more leverages. United States is the world's largest economy, world's largest leading technology power, world's largest and powerful military, and so on. It attracts actually best brains from around the world. So United States is not like any other country. It's a unique country which is constituted of the smart people from around the world. So that is its unique leverage. And therefore, when we talk of information flows, how do we set agenda in international relations or international affairs? What is important? When I was young, nuclear issues were more important. When you reach this age, climate change is the issue. So who tells us nuclear weapons are no longer the main issue? Climate change is the main issue. Someone is controlling that information flow. And United States has a great control on generation of information and also distribution of that information. Look at the top 10 companies in IT sector. You'll find all of them are hosted in United States.
Yes.
Any information you want to look at, you either say, hey Siri, or you want to Google it. That's not Indian. So someone else is telling you answers to your questions. Of course, now important question is, should India just give up? No. In a situation like this, India has to also explore what are its unique leverages. Supposing if you are a cricketer and I play tennis, if I compete with you in cricket, I will of course lose. But I should also try to make a bigger brand of tennis if I play tennis. So India, therefore, you see, is now lately promoting Indian culture, Indian diaspora. No other leader has received the kind of large-scale welcome that Indian Prime Minister receives around the world. Even if American president is in New Delhi, nobody is shouting Biden, Biden. No. So one has to explore what are those unique leverages that a country has. Yoga, for example, Ayurveda, for example, Indian classical music, Indian Bollywood, for example. So India has to also highlight what are the unique leverages that India has and cultivate, harness those leverages to become much more visible. And if you're much more visible, more engaged around the world, you see now India is much more engaged around the world now. So that is how you also begin to at least participate in what we call agenda setting. And that is what public diplomacy has to do. Public diplomacy's task is to how to explain to the world who we are. What do we have that we can give to the world? The whole debate on DPIs, digital public infrastructure. CoWIN of India during the pandemic was used by dozens and dozens of countries. Now UPI, Unified Payment Interface, is being used around the world. So many countries. So that originated in India, like yoga originated in India. So India has to gradually become a country of greater attraction around the world, which India is becoming. Of course, we can't compete as of now with the United States, but we are doing better than how we were doing earlier. So that is how public diplomacy is constantly advertising, explaining, elucidating, explicating both to people around the world and to their own citizens as to why should India, for example, if India is giving $10 billion of aid to some country, maybe Indian voters get angry. Why are you giving money to others? So we have to explain why it is important that emerging power like India, going to be third largest economy, has to do things that we did not do before. That is the task of public diplomacy. And therefore, India is constantly focusing on engaging Indian diaspora. 25, 27 millions of Indians are around the world. They are now super excited to assert that they are Indians. Each of them become ambassador of India without any payment. Because they are lining up, they are shouting in favor of Prime Minister Modi, Modi. You see how that is possible? No other national leader in the world has that kind of, Indian Prime Minister addresses 75,000 people when he goes to Britain, 35,000 when he goes to United States. It's a large number. So our large population is our advantage. See, how many countries have 1.4 billion people? We have 27 billion. Sometimes I joke that Indians of the same number as the population of New Zealand or Hong Kong are sitting on airports to catch their flight as I'm talking to you. So look at your advantages. India has large number of population. We are focusing on skill building. We are focusing on innovation so that the population becomes an asset, not liability. So India has to cultivate, harness its leverages, and public diplomacy has to let everybody know. That is the task of public diplomacy, to educate everyone at home and abroad. What can India bring to the table when it goes to international forums? Why should other countries get excited to know about India, partner with India, work with India? And that public diplomacy, of course, is primarily task of Ministry of External Affairs, but is partly also task of all of us. Whether you are a civil servant or you're a professor, in many ways, we are all introducing India to the world. And maybe sometime introducing India to our own people. And that, I think, is the task of public diplomacy, which of course originates in Ministry of External Affairs, but little bit of it is happening among all of us. We are all doing bit of it, little bit of that. I hope you are satisfied with my explanation.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, because best wishes for your exams.
Thank you, sir.
Work well and stay patient. Don't get too much edgy about. The more relaxed you are, the better you will do in your exam.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. I think there's a question by Vaishvi ji. Are you able to unmute Vaishvi ji and go ahead with
Yes,
the
I can
question?
see her. Yeah.
Yes, good evening, sir. My name is Vashvi. I'm a lawyer. I'm also preparing for civil services. So my question is regarding multilateralism. So don't you think that UN is going the way League of Nations went in 1920s due to its failure to prevent crisis, and it is becoming a third world country hegemony club?
Thank you so much. I think in my own experience, I'm seeing the first lawyer trying to join civil services, which is very good news. I've seen a lot of engineers and medicine people trying to join civil services, which is also good. But law is another area where India has to engage in that sense in so many international conventions that are in the making now. So happy to see that lawyers, instead of focusing on making money, are focusing on becoming a civil servant, which is a good news. Now, when you say about multilateral diplomacy, sorry, your question was, I just missed that.
That these multilateral organizations like the UN, they are becoming a hegemony club of first world nations.
Got it. Thank you. Yes, I would agree with you, particularly when you see United Nations virtually dysfunctional when it comes to Ukraine crisis or Israel-Hamas war. One begins to think that United Nations is not really effective because all the peace efforts are happening outside United Nations. India is currently engaged in peace efforts in Ukraine, for example. But we don't as yet have an alternative. There is no doubt United Nations was created in 1945, and world has changed. Not just UN, but all other organizations that were created at that time, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, all kinds of other agencies and organs of United Nations. From 1945 to 1960, the membership of United Nations had increased from 50 to 110. At that time, in early 1960s, the first reforms happened. UN Security Council membership expanded from 10 to 15. Economic and Social Council expanded from 18 to 28. But now, world is changing, but UN is not reforming itself. So there is no doubt United Nations, is not reflective of the world we live in, and therefore, remember I'm saying therefore not very effective. In International Monetary Fund, for example, China, which today has 18% of global GDP, has 6% voting votage. How do we understand that dichotomy? But we don't as yet have an alternative is the problem. And countries that are sitting on advantage, as you said, Western control, IMF is always headed by European citizen, World Bank is always headed by American citizen. Of course, Britain and France, which are now smaller countries. India is now larger GDP than Britain. India is definitely many times larger in population. Is not having permanent seat in UN Security Council. Of course, that needs reformation. But because of League of Nations having failed, simply because United States did not join it, and of course, the rest of the story is known, United Nations was created with a veto power. And that is how it survived. Otherwise, like League of Nations, it would have died within first decade. because it was understood that if any international organizations takes any decision against the interests of great powers, it will not survive. So they created a system of veto power where the 5 great powers of that time at end of Second World War were given veto so that United Nations will never take a decision which will be against their national interests. But the reality has now changed, but we still follow the same thing that the permanent 5 must agree if any reforms have to happen. And they know very well, if they reform, they lose their power. And therefore, they are not interested in reforming. What is happening as a result is that there are so many interesting parallel outside efforts which are now happening. There are groupings like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and they have added now 5 more new members, 4 have joined. They have created a new development bank and so on. From 2017, China is world's largest donor country. So if United Nations is not reforming itself, it is becoming marginalized. It is becoming less central to how international relations are conducted. So I always say the question is no longer on India, whether India is permanent member of UN Security Council. Question now should be to UN Security Council, whether it is credible enough. If India is out, is UNSC credible, minus India? So that is an ongoing question. There are no easy answers to that, but hopefully incrementally, United Nations is getting sidelined and new groupings are emerging. For example, there is a quadrilateral security framework in Indo-Pacific where India is invited. There's another quad in the West Asian, UAE, Israel, US, and India. So India is being welcomed in all these international forums, which are today becoming much more influential than United Nations. So if United Nations doesn't reform itself, it will just fall by the side, which is not a good news because we do need a potent working international organization. United Nations has created so many conventions over a period of time. The one which all of you keep hearing is United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas. So it has created a lot of good work, but it is falling by the side because it is no longer now representative of the world we live in. And some of the reforms are happening, but they are so snail-paced, so incremental that they are not helping these existing international organizations, including United Nations, to become effective. They will not be effective if they are not representative. And that's a reality as of now. So I don't have any clear answer as to how. I have an answer, yes, they need to reform, but how they will reform, there is no clear answer as of now. So you can notice that India has virtually given up on this campaign India used to have, that 4 countries, Germany, Brazil, India, Japan, would come together and work for reforming United Nations. India's Prime Minister's speeches, if you read now, speak in a very different fashion on the need of reforming global governance, where he is not looking for what India will get. His speeches and foreign minister's speeches are now saying, if the global governance have to be effective, then all these institutions must be representative. Otherwise, collectively, the world will suffer, and as part of this world, India will also suffer. No longer trying to get just 1 seat for India. No, that's no longer the focus now. Because India is sufficiently recognized around the world now. Whether we are in that seat or not that seat doesn't matter anymore. In fact, if we are in that seat, we may not be as effective as we are outside that seat now. Because sometimes when you're part of that seat, you have to compromise and sign on something which you don't even like. But now you can criticize saying these guys are not doing good enough. So in that, sorry, I'm giving a rather long answer, but yes, reforms are required, but reforms are not appearing very likely to happen in a hurry. Thank you. I hope you are happy with the answer I gave. And I'm happy to see lawyers also taking interest in civil service.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, Shivangi ji, you can go ahead with your question, followed by Kaustav ji.
Good evening, sir. Sir, I have 2 questions. So the first question would be, as we are seeing the classic ancient debate of starting from the NAM itself, US versus Russia. So in the context of uh, Ukraine war, as people are more empathetic towards Russian people, as we have more cultural ties, and US is backing up Ukraine. So what should be the India's stance? I know there is no easy answer, but I want to know your view.
I think it's a simple thing that India has increasingly become capable of speaking and doing things that it is comfortable with. It is no longer now doing anything under pressure. And this whole focus on golden mean, median approach is civilizational to us. It's not only one party or the other party. See, when there was a Cold War, we chose to be non-aligned. We said we don't want to be with either Warsaw Treaty Organization or with North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We want to be non-aligned. But gradually under pressure, we had become closer to Soviet Union. You're right on that. But now increasingly, India is saying that we will do things that are good for us, things that we are at home with. So yes, it appears that between a fight between a giant and a pygmy, if I say I'm neutral, then it is not strictly a neutrality. That part is true. But it's also true that that pygmy is being helped by 50 other countries together. President Joe Biden in March last year in a speech had said, I have raised a coalition of 50 nations who are today working to help Ukraine fight that war against Russia. He did not say, I have made a coalition of 50 countries to find peace between Russia and Ukraine. So the focus is to strengthen Ukraine to fight its war against Russia. That's not India's focus. India's focus is constantly trying to give humanitarian assistance to Ukrainians. India has been sending Ukrainian people humanitarian assistance. India has been increasingly becoming more and more firm with President Putin that this era is not era of war. This pains us when we see bombing, killing civilian people. It is not acceptable that any nation can unilaterally change its borders. You just look at Prime Minister's speeches over a period of time covering this issue, and you will find increasingly assertive tone towards Russia. But at the same time, yes, India has imported large quantities of crude oil from Russia. India-Russia trade, which used to be $8-9 billion, is now $67 billion. So that's true. That may have indirectly helped Russia to stand against very stringent united sanctions from Western countries. But West is also, look at their double speak. Europeans do not want to import any oil from Russia, but they're importing all the Russian oil from India. So it's good. India is making some money. India is very good in refining oil. So we are importing Russian oil, crude oil, refining it here and exporting it to Europe. Smart strategy. So India is what I call India is following proactive neutrality. It's not rigid, dead, fixed neutrality. It's a proactive neutrality, which is constantly evolving with period of time. And China's foreign minister last year made a 13-point proposal for peace in Ukraine. That was demolished, completely criticized by Western countries. Now, this year in June, you had World Peace Summit by Switzerland, Swiss Peace Summit, where Russia was not invited, China did not go, India went, we did not sign. So what is the use of these grandstanding? This is grandstanding. I'm doing something great for the world. India's approach is completely reverse. Piecemeal, imperceptible, behind the closed doors, modest, slow-paced, trying to talk to both sides, nudging both sides that you need to talk to each other. It's not grandstanding. I have 14-point proposal. No. nothing like that. We are trying to do something that can at least accelerate the process of peace talks whenever possible in future. We are not dictating that here is my final document from Swiss Peace Summit, please accept it. That's not the way to bring peace. So India, I think, has stood its ground. Of course, initially Russia was unhappy. Initially, United States was also unhappy. But over a period of time, they have understood that India will stand on its own feet. India will do what is best for India, just like they do what is best for them. I mean, United States exports 25% of the total defense exports around the world. So wars are good for United States. 20 years in Afghanistan, some 3 years in Ukraine, some 1 year in Israel is good. So all the aid packages that Joe Biden is issuing, $100 billion and so on, they are not going to Ukraine, they are going to Pennsylvania, to the arms factories. And what Ukraine is getting is not money, they're getting weapons. So India doesn't feel at home with that strategy of saying, I give you more guns, please keep killing other side. We find it very strange. Civilizationally, we find it very strange. To say that we will support you by giving you more and more and more weapons, you just keep killing each other. But that is what American economy is based on. It's a very powerful military-industrial complex that funds elections. So they speak the language that they think is taking forward their national interest. India is speaking the language that India feels is taking forward India's interests. In that sense, I don't think that we should call India's policy on Ukraine as pro-Russian. India has been basically trying to ensure that both sides begin to talk to each other. That's what it is. And if India is second largest importer of oil. And there was times when, we got pressure from who, and we stopped buying oil from Iran. Second time we stopped buying oil from Venezuela. Today we don't worry about that pressure. Today we say we will go ahead and buy oil from Russia because it helps Indian economy. We want to grow faster. Russia is in compulsion. They are willing to give us oil on friendship prices. Fine, we'll take that oil and we are selling it to Ukraine. I mean, Europe. That in that sense legitimizes India's imports, and it gives a good destination for us to export refined oil. So I think it's a complex story. I'm sure each nation has interpretations of what India is doing, just like India has interpretations of what United States is doing. Maybe an American scholar will explain the same question differently to you. But I am not American, so I will not explain it like an American. I'm an Indian, so I will explain this question to you as an Indian scholar. But thank you, that was a very interesting question.
Sir, I have another one. It's
okay.
Yeah, it's little out of context, but as we have talked about diplomacy, so as you are a veteran here, so can you please tell the options the person have to become a diplomat other than civil services?
You often must have heard people saying, oh, now you're being diplomatic. So you can become diplomatic anytime. You could become diplomatic right away. So becoming diplomatic and becoming a diplomat is different. You could be a doctor, you could be a musician, and you could still be diplomatic in your way you deal with people. But we are talking here of diplomatic service. And the only two ways of joining diplomatic service is one, obviously, as you know, and you are in that age of going through civil services exams, opting for IFS, which increasingly I notice is no longer number one option of most candidates. If you want to be civil IFS, you have to put that as your first option and have a good explanation as to why, because it's not a normal thing now to see students, I see them in interviews, they don't have IFS as their first choice. They usually put IAS as their first choice. Sometimes even other services, IPS, or even sometimes, income tax and so on, higher than IFS. And so if you put IFS your first choice, you also should have a good answer as to why, convincing answer as to why you want to have diplomatic service. And second, of course, which comes much later, if you're an expert in a certain field, you could be co-opted, either as we now call in lateral entry for 3 years at the level of Joint Secretary, or you could be co-opted in various other negotiations on sort of limited engagement in that sense of at your level also now, not in terms of becoming a diplomat, but Ministry of External Affairs increasingly now encouraging youngsters to also join as consultants. They are not, you don't have diplomatic immunity, you're not a diplomat, but you're part of Ministry of External Affairs. So they also hire young scholars as consultants on policy planning division particularly does it. So there are multiple ways of doing diplomacy, but I understand you want to talk about IFS. And for that, मन लगा के पढ़ने का और एग्जाम देने का.
Sir, not IFS, other than IFS, like
other than IFS, then I think perhaps you're indicating to various international organizations.
yes.
Yeah, that of course is again a possibility, but then you're not Indian diplomat, you're international civil servant in that. That's a slightly different thing, and you have to keep track of these various international organizations who advertise various positions. But that's not Indian diplomat. You'll be, in that sense, international civil servants. They're called international civil servants, ICS. We used to have Indian civil service at some stage, but now international civil servants are also called ICS. Yeah, that is different organizations have their different criterion and different timing, and they are not like annual exam or things like that. Yeah, best wishes to you.
Thank you, sir. We have a few more questions. Could we take them up quickly?
Yeah, we have about 12 minutes still to 6 o'clock.
Yes, yes, sir. So, Kaustubji, you can go ahead with your question.
Hello again, sir. Sir, you did mention at the very initial hours of your speech that the world today is an interconnected and an interdependent one. So you also mentioned about the multilateralism and the multilateral diplomacy herein. So I just wanted to know about one aspect, talking about two very important groupings, regional groupings rather. One is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, that's the Quad. And the other one, if I need to talk about, is the BRICS, which you also mentioned, both of them rather. So the visualization of Quad is a little different. It takes on to counter the growing importance of China in the region, while BRICS talks about differently that it has to talk about the G7's control over the international organizations. So the idea of both these organizations are very different, and India being a part of both these organizations. So I just wanted to know that how sustainable it is in the future hours, because I can see there is another question talking about multi-alignment, which the Prime Minister has also recently talked about, that we will not stay at distance, but we will grow closer to all the countries around. So how sustainable is it in the longer run? So this is my question.
Any policy posture, its sustainability is determined by whether it is in your DNA. If you're just trying to ape some other model which is not inherently in you, then of course that will not be sustainable. But in that sense, I think it is again part of Indian civilization that we do not want to take sides. That's not, we don't want to take extreme sides in any situation. We want to follow more like a golden mean, median mode kind of a situation, whether it is mixed economy or panchayat raj or it is non-alignment foreign policy. Engaging all is like that. So for example, West Asia is my favorite example. India is the greatest friend of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Iran, UAE, everybody. Countries that don't talk to each other. India is friendly to all of these. Of course, it has advantages and disadvantages. Advantages that everybody is your friend and therefore you're maximizing your partnerships in that sense in as many sectors as possible. The flip side could be that if you're a friend of all, maybe some of them think you're a friend of none in that sense. That could be the reverse interpretation possible. But that also means a very carefully calibrated policy posturing, articulation of that policy, and that thin line that you're kind of increasingly your maneuvering space is very, very limited. You have to be careful. So yes, that question is often asked, why is India and how is India able to sustain itself both in BRICS and in Quad? It seems that so far we have managed. In BRICS, for example, there is China. In Quad, there is United States. They, of course, see each other as adversaries. They look at each other as challenge. So China wants to reform global governance by creating alternatives that are, sort of that are minus United States and its friends. It wants to underline that G7 is no longer the center of gravitation. BRICS is center of gravitation. It wants to talk about globalizing yuan. It wants to increase the use of local currencies, but from a mindset of de-dollarization. Similarly, in Quad, United States, particularly during Trump period, who might return to White House again, Mike Pompeo's speeches were so much harshly anti-Chinese. He used to say, Chinese party is different from people and I'm addressing Chinese people. In 2019 Delhi foreign ministers meeting of Quad, 4 foreign ministers had to issue separate statements. They couldn't even come to collective one because of the kind of mindset of creating Asian NATO in Quad that was at that time existing. Today, no one talks of Quad as an Asian NATO. In my own limited judgment, understanding, India stood up and said, we do not want to see Quad militarized. We will not discuss any hardcore conventional military matters. At best, we will cover non-military issues, non-traditional security issues. So therefore, in 2021, when Joe Biden came in September, he had to start AUKUS, because that is where military posturing will happen. Quad will not do military posturing. Similarly, in BRICS also, India has carefully calibrated that it wants to make sure, and you hear Indian Foreign Minister repeatedly saying BRICS is not, it is non-Western, it is not anti-Western. You must have heard him repeatedly saying that. BRICS is non-Western, it's not anti-Western. So India, in that sense, can be seen as a voice of sanity, or a country that wants to basically do bridge building between East, West, and North, South, rather than taking sides. And it will sustain, and it has sustained, because that is what India is inherently. India doesn't believe in following extreme positions on either side. India believes in more or less, sort of staying at center of, both sides, leaning to left, leaning to right, but not being extreme in taking decisions. And so far we have survived in that sense. But of course, Chinese are a bigger economy in BRICS, and in fact, China's economy is several times larger than rest of the 9 put together. So that does give China a certain amount of leverages. Russia has gradually tilted towards China very openly, very clearly. So India has to walk very carefully both in Quad and in BRICS, but it has tried its best to stand by what it believes in. And one has to also be ready to bear costs of what you stand for. In fact, one of my friend, when I was young, he's as old as I am now, used to say, if someone is friend of all, maybe sometime that person could be dubious. How can you be friend of all? If you stand for some principles, you're going to have some people who are not unhappy with us. Now, interesting it is that India's unhappiness about India is kind of equally distributed across the spectrum. It's not that one country hates us. It's that all countries over a period of time have some uncomfort with India. Russia has uncomfort, China has uncomfort, America has uncomfort, France has uncomfort. But they find that, with rapidly changing, transforming young India, we have the world's largest youth as a pool in India. And youth will innovate more, will consume more, will produce more, will move more things. And government, if that government challenges it, can push India into third largest economy much earlier than 2030. And that is appearing to be more attractive to all these countries than what India stands for and what makes India do things that they sometimes don't like. Great powers, let me also add on something which I personally think very strongly. When great powers begin to do things from what they stand for, sometimes it makes others very angry. I mean, look at United States, what it did in Afghanistan, what it did in Pakistan to Osama bin Laden. When I was young like you, President of Panama was airlifted by Americans and brought to jail in San Diego or somewhere here. And his mug shots were advertised on newspapers next morning. He was president of Panama. China is now going around taking over the South China Sea. Some people are unhappy. So India will also do increasingly things that in our judgment will be right, but maybe in somebody else's judgment it will not be right. But it fundamentally is something that should be inherently India feels at home with. It's something that makes us pursue our national interest, takes us forward. So far it looks like India is a valued member of both BRICS nations and Quad. Therefore, United States, when it started second Quad, it also invited India. The second Quad for West Asia, UAE, Israel, US, and India. Because as I just told you, India is friend of everybody there. So India is a good country to be brought into Quad for West Asia because it has access to all of these nations. And all these nations find India is a good friend. So far it has worked, but I understand it is full of challenges. Luckily, we have a very articulate foreign minister who's a career diplomat again, who doesn't need any notes. He can speak extempore, he understands, he knows people. And at this moment of India emerging as a powerful nation, I think it's good that we have him as foreign minister. Thank you, Kaustubh.
So can I give a supplementary, sir?
Sure. I have time, but I don't want to hold you hostage beyond 6 o'clock. And let Reed decide whatever she's the host now. Yes, you can ask another question.
So actually, you just mentioned about the BRICS and the rising importance of China in that organization, considering the recent 5 more countries, excepting Argentina, who did not join. So I just wanted to know, because China's importance is rising in that particular grouping. So how can India do better in that particular thing? What is the way forward for India to dominate the areas within the BRICS? So that's what I wanted to.
First of all, Indian narratives now no longer talk of domination. That is a banned word now. That's a taboo word. We are trying to become Vishwamitra. You're hearing that again now. From Vishwaguru initially, but now increasingly acceptable term is India is trying to become Vishwamitra. And that again is something India feels at home in that sense of engaging the world as a friend. And yes, China is a reality. Nearly $20 trillion economy definitely is something one has to keep in mind. So you notice that India is becoming increasingly pragmatic. So we have tension on the border, but our trade is booming. Our foreign ministers are meeting all the time. Our national leaders are meeting all the time. People are traveling to 500,000 people go to China every year from India. So that pragmatic approach of being careful of China, standing up to China when need be, but not holding everything else to this, and allowing some other things to happen, but also showcasing a certain anger, anxiety when you want to put additional regulatory controls on investments in China or China's investments in India, some additional vetting and scrutiny for visas of Chinese people to India. That's a signaling that happens that things are not going fine. But ultimately, 2 leaders have met. They have signed some agreement recently. Disengagement is happening. Remember, this is the first example when China had to shift to peace building with India. No other country has stood up against China eyeball to eyeball with 60,000 people on the border for 4.5 years. The other example is South China Sea, where incrementally Chinese have virtually taken over control of South China Sea. It used to be called 2 steps forward, 1 step backward strategy. It didn't work against India. So they tried another new strategy called staying power. I have deep pockets and I can stay there longer, and let's see who gets tired first, or shall we say who blinks first. India refused to blink first. And constant negotiations continued. 35 rounds of interministerial working mechanism of consultation and cooperation on border affairs, consultation and coordination on border affairs, 22 meetings of corps commanders, sometimes going 11 hours in a meeting. That is what, that is diplomacy. So India has stood up, and therefore, finally, disengagement, withdrawal of forces happening, and 2 countries are talking to each other now, fine again. So I think this is set an example of India being the only neighbor of China which can stand up to China on its own without American You remember Donald Trump was offering mediation in India-China dispute, and India said, no, I think we will manage China challenge on our own. And we don't think we need anybody, third party, to come in and help. And India had patience. India waited for as long as possible. And finally, I think the good start has happened. So China definitely is a very powerful neighbor and also partner in several sectors, particularly in many of the regional global forums. You see, China and India speak virtually similar language, if not identical language, on issues of climate change, on pandemics, on terrorism, on all kinds of things. But of course, when it comes to protecting Pakistan, then on terrorism, their language changes. When it is India getting permanent seat on UN Security Council, yes, their language changes. But there are also several areas where these two countries work together hand in hand, if you allow me to say, including they used to have a hand-in-hand exercise of two armies against terrorism at some stage. So that's why I called hand in hand. So I think it's a very, very pragmatic approach that India as a rising power has to adopt. China is definitely a challenge to reckon with. But do we want to put all eggs in one basket, that either you're my enemy or you're my friend? Which is how sometimes Western nations behave. Now, for example, Western nations are only focusing on arming Ukraine to fight against Russia, had put an end to all relationships with Russia. How can peace talks happen? India allows that space where peace talks can happen. So I think that has resulted in peace. So I'm talking too much. Let me stop here.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you,
Now-
Costa, and best wishes to your exams also.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Now we have a question by Vaishnavi ji. You can go ahead.
Okay, Vaishnavi.
I'm audible.
Yeah.
Yes, you're audible. You're not visible yet. I
Am
can see
I
you.
visible now?
Yes, I can see you, Vaishnavi.
Thank you, Costa. We've asked most of my question already, so you've also answered. My question was in context of the 19 Indian entities that have been sanctioned by the United States. So my question was again in lines of how would a power such as the United States react? How would its discomfort become visible to India, and how does India sort of plan on navigating these circumstances? Because it seems like a very like a tightrope sort of a situation almost.
Vaishnavi, the first thing to remember is that in any two nations relations, it's not going to be simplistic, one kind of relationship. It will have multiple shades. So United States is a great friend of India. And therefore, about 24 other countries who are called friends and allies of United States also become friend of India. This applied to China. This is applying to India now. So broadly, the big picture is one of advantage by building partnership and friendship with the United States. But United States has its own pressure groups and lobbies that work as to how its foreign policy will be conducted. And it's an election year becomes particularly vulnerable to those entities because it needs votes. And you're noticing that recently there's some controversy between India and Canada. But there's also similar insinuations from United States. But the way United States and India are working on that insinuation and how India and Canada are working on those insinuations are different. The way of working on those issues is very different. So when you have 19 entities named because of this increasingly, difficult issues between two countries, in this case, of course, because they are seen to be working with Russia, and I said that Russia-India trade has shot up from $8-9 billion to 67. So of course, hundreds of agencies are getting involved into what we are importing from Russia in that sense, or what we are doing with those imports. This is, to me, largely symbolic. Because when we were buying Russian S-3 missiles, you remember Katsa, the famous law that Trump had passed, should have automatically led to slapping of sanctions on India. And similar sanctions only 8 months before were slapped on China. But no such sanctions were slapped on India. India also helped, if you remember, December 6, 2021, visit of President Putin, 6-hour visit to India. The contract that was signed about those S-3 missiles was unique of its kind. That is where the lawyers become very significant. The language was such that it could not use any word that would have invoked Katsa. It talked of contract that will lead to potentially India receiving something of that nature. So lawyers are smart in using the language which will be a face saver to both sides. India will receive the missile and United States doesn't want to invoke Katsa and slap sanctions, can still avoid invoking sanctions. So on many areas, on more significant areas, you see great cooperation. But here, because this whole issue of Russia is something that is becoming an issue of credibility for Joe Biden and Democrats in the elections, they have to do some symbolic things, and they have done this. And 19 out of hundreds of such companies cannot be seen serious business. It's a symbolic gesture that they have to do, and India can understand. And sometimes what happens, I think I should also mention, Vaishnavi, a lot of things don't come in public. They come maybe 30 years later in archives. That maybe diplomats had actually already briefed each other that I'm going to do something, it is meant for my domestic consumption. I'm in election year, don't worry about it, don't mind it. There have been historic instances of this nature. I'm not saying it happened in this case, but these things also happen. That countries take each other into confidence, saying that I need to take something, decision like this, I need to speak in some public speech like this. Don't worry too much about it. This is for my domestic consumption. This is not actually that I'm angry with you or I'm going to harm you. There are historic evidences of such things. I don't know if that is true in this case, but I don't see that as a serious rebuff on India. Particularly when I keep saying all American friends in Europe are buying oil refined by India, which is Russian oil. So, it's a complex world and people have to take complex choices, and that's where it is. Symbolism, rather than, I think it's more symbolic than substantive. Okay. Are you also aspirant to civil service, Vaishnavi?
So it's sort of discouraging to see so many aspirants. So I'm considering doing a PhD at this point. I have a background in public policy. I'm pursuing a course on conflict transformation and peace building right now, which is a 1-year course.
LSR?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm sort of still keeping my cards to myself and seeing what
Remember your foreign minister now, whole life diplomat, is a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University.
Yes, I remember. I live very close to JNU, so it's something my parents also keep reminding me that, it's very close by. You can just
You're
do
most welcome to visit us. I'm sure you have visited us. You may have friends here.
Yeah, I do. I will visit.
You're most welcome to come to us and for any advice. But what I'm underlining is that you're doing PhD doesn't disqualify you from becoming an IFS.
Yes, that's true. It's just the competition of it all, which probably does.
Competition is always there. Even if you start playing harmonium tomorrow or dance Kathak, there will be always competition in life.
That is true.
If you're aspiring to do good in whatever career you choose, there will always be competition. Okay, best of luck. I think we have gone beyond 10 minutes beyond our time.
Yes. Are there any other questions from the audience member?
Let me also mention, I'm going to meet you again to deliver one talk, and then in the concluding of this whole program also, Cohort 3 ending, will also have me again. So I hope to see you at least twice again. And otherwise, you can Google and find my email and always approach me whenever you want. Best wishes to Cohort 3. And I'm sure all of you are, every next cohort is coming with smarter people. So it's a delight to see that all of you are engaging with IMPRI, and IMPRI is also becoming very credible by attracting very, very young and brilliant brains into cohorts like this. So best wishes to the course going forward from here, and looking forward to seeing you again, and back to Reet now.
Thank you so much, sir, especially for taking out the time to answer all the questions in such great detail and with so much patience. I believe I speak on behalf of everyone when I say that we learned a lot from you, and it was truly a privilege to have had the opportunity to learn so much from you. We really look forward to the honor of welcoming you back in our future events. So, thank you so much, sir.
God bless you.
Thank you, sir. So before we close today's session, we would love to hear from all our participants. I know some of the participants have already spoken, but if you want to add anything, and we would love to hear from those who have not spoken so far, just a brief introduction of your name, designation, organization that you work with or are studying at, and where you're based off from. So is there anyone who would like to go ahead with this?
Hello,
Vaishnavi
madam.
ji? Yes, Mohammed ji, please go ahead.
My name is Mohammed Irfan. I am working at Khidmat Bank, which is a Muslim minority bank. Actually, I am an aspirant, civil service aspirant. So last year I was enrolled in this course, but because of lack of money, I don't enroll in the course. Right now, I am working as a part time. Now it is a chance for me to learn some information from great scholars like IMPRI and all these things. So I'm gathering more information. So I am also trying to give more information. This, this one.
Okay, that's great. We're really grateful to have you join us for this cohort, Mohammed ji. Now, Vaishnavi ji, would you like to go ahead?
I just briefly sort of spoke about myself. So if I'm to go again, I've finished my master's. I did it in public policy from National Law School, Bangalore. Right now, I'm pursuing a 1-year course in conflict transformation and peace building. As I said, I'm figuring out if I want to continue with doing a PhD or maybe even appearing for civil services, as Sir also suggested. So yeah, I'm sort of at a crossroads at this point.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now Kotla Sai Krishna ji, or Ansari Usma ji, would you like to go ahead? Okay. I think Vikas, Kaustav, and Shivangi ji have already spoken, but if there's anything else you would like to add? All right.
If you want, I can speak it again. So, Shivangi this side. Hi, I have just completed my master's and clear UGC NET exam, looking for PhD admission. So, preparing for PhD, that's it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Shivangi ji. So with that, we come to an end of day 1 of Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, Cohort 3, an international winter school program, a 2-month immersive online certificate training course. I, Reetlath, researcher, IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, would like to propose the formal vote of thanks on behalf of IMPRI, Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies, New Delhi. We are grateful to our experts for day 1, Professor Swaran Singh ji, for taking out their valuable time and giving an opportunity to the participants to learn from this online certificate program. We thank all our participants who have raised pertinent questions and actively participated in today's deliberation. And anyone who's left for their introduction can also give it in the next session. Readings for this session have been shared in your email, and a video of the session will also be shared with you for your learning. We look forward to welcoming you on our day 2nd of the certificate course on 9th November at 4 p.m. We are grateful if you're watching us later on YouTube or listening to us on our various podcasts or reading our publications. We hope you continue to join in future to our IMPRI Web Policy Talk and Web Policy Learning. Wishing you all a very good evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.